Hello, everybody. Welcome back to From Guns to Keyboards, Season 2, Episode 4. We are here deep into a hostage deal where almost 20 hostages by this point have been released in a ceasefire agreement brokered by the Trump administration between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We started out earlier this year on January 19th with 97 hostages in Gaza. That number has since been reduced to 79. And we're here in this episode to, among other things, discuss what's next in terms of the hostage deal, in terms of where the region is going now that Bibi is flying to Washington and is going to speak with Trump about the future of Gaza. And the big question that is before all of us, which is, are we going to keep this good going and bring back the remaining 79 hostages that are still in the Gaza Strip? So a lot of talk this episode on the ongoing ceasefire in Gaza and where we see things going.
Yeah, so it's definitely been a very emotional past few weeks. Typically once, sometimes twice a week, you'll see hostages being released in groups of three. Obviously for Israelis, it's a lot of feeling, regardless of, I think, how people feel about the hostage deal taking place or happening in the first place. You see, even the far-right ministers like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, you see them tweeting, our hearts go out to the hostages returning home, welcome back to Israel, welcome back home. It's definitely emotional.
So, if we're talking about emotion, then let me then take us back to some of the big highlights of the week that we saw that I think affected all of us very emotionally. We saw the initial groups of hostages getting released, as you mentioned, 18 in total released since January 19th, the beginning of the deal. And the country is absolutely enthused to have these hostages back. And at the same time, we're seeing these images come out of the Gaza Strip of Hamas reasserting its authority and taking these and organizing these grand ceremonies where it's handing the hostages back over to Israel with rifles slung over their shoulders and demonstrating their strength to the public. How do you, as someone who fought in Gaza, someone who saw a lot of the things that we're seeing on the news now up close and personal, how do you process what we've been seeing on the news over the past couple of weeks?
I mean, you and I have been saying it since we started this podcast, since episode 1, I think, which was, if you're not willing to talk about the day after until the day after comes, then you're just leaving Hamas as the sole source of power in Gaza. And as you and I are we don't have any special insight or particular experience with counterinsurgency, but I think even you and me sitting here could see from a mile away that if the Israeli government refused to engage in any kind of counterinsurgency and refused to discuss who is going to govern Gaza the day after, then Hamas would just take control. And that's exactly what happened. I think Israel very much played into Hamas's hands. When I see the images and the videos coming out of both the hostage release, and now we're seeing more and more just videos of Gaza itself, either filmed directly by the Gazans returning to what's now left of their homes, which is not much, or by just journalists now having more freedom to move around within the Gaza Strip, we're seeing just how terribly the Palestinians suffered as a result of this, for the average Palestinian citizen. And the only people who won, it wasn't the Israelis, it wasn't the Palestinians, it was just Hamas. I think Hamas got what they wanted out of this war. They came out the real winners at the expense of Israelis and Palestinians alike. That's my particular take.
Well, I can definitely, I don't know if I agree with what you're saying, but I can definitely identify with a lot of the points that you bring up. I think that for sure, if we look at the plain data points here, Israel did not achieve any of its three main war aims bringing back all the hostages, the replacement of Hamas as a governing authority in the Gaza Strip, or at least in the original language, the destruction of Hamas as a governing authority in the Gaza Strip, and the destruction of Hamas as a military authority in the Gaza Strip. All of these war aims have yet to be achieved. So Israel certainly can't be declared the victor here by any objective measure if the objective measure is the war goals. Whether or not this means Hamas won, I'm not entirely sure. I think their position in Gaza has definitely been shaken by the war. I think a lot of Gazans are looking at Hamas in a much more critical fashion and think that what Hamas did on October 7th was a very selfish move that did not take into account the plight of the average Gazan that would have to deal with these repercussions. And I think there's definitely a lot of pushback from the Gazan side against Hamas. But, I definitely can identify with what you're saying on the most basic level, that at the end of the day, we thought that we would be negotiating the day after with international organizations like the United Nations, with our partners in the region like Saudi Arabia, with the United States, with the European Union. And at the end of the day, we're negotiating the day after with Hamas. And clearly, any negotiation of the day after with Hamas is going to include a day after with Hamas, no matter what comes out of any discussion in the White House, which I guess kind of leads us to the earlier news point that I was discussing, which is Bibi's flight to Washington, where he is supposedly supposed to discuss the plan for the day after for Gaza with Trump. What do you expect can come out of this?
Anything and everything. I mean, it's Donald Trump. That guy, look, he's certainly... It's quite obvious, I think, to anybody that Bibi wants the war to continue. If for no other reason than to avoid declaring that we lost. Because as we just said, none of Israel's war aims were achieved, and that's going to fall squarely on one individual, the individual who made the aims of the war public to everybody, who announced them repeatedly, who promised nothing except for total victory, and who is now having his people suffer Hamas's mental games on a weekly basis. And so it's obvious from Bibi's perspective what he wants. Trump has made it very clear that he's not interested in this war. That for him, he wants to be the peace president. He wants Gaza to be done because, quite frankly, it's such an effort and attention suck from any administration that it makes it very difficult to unite the American people for some other potentially difficult, typically economic scheme, which in this case appears to be major tariffs on all of the U.S.'s major trading partners. So you really need the American people united for something as groundbreaking as this type of undertaking. My guess is that Trump is going to promise Bibi something big, perhaps annexing the West Bank, perhaps moving the Gazans out of Gaza, as he's said repeatedly and publicly, in exchange for Bibi ending the war, but at least being able to come home, carrying something in his teeth, saying, "Hey, look what I managed to scrape from the Americans." That's my expectation.
I think you may be onto something there. I think that from Bibi's perspective, he is at his core a politician that is going to make decisions based on what he believes will most suit his political interests. I think in the short term, he is looking at the plan for Gaza first and foremost through the lens of how the domestic reaction has been to the hostage release. And I think that the mass public enthusiasm over the previous release of 18 hostages in the past deal and the expected release of the rest of the 79 hostages in the rest of the deal will lead Bibi to come to the conclusion that it is his political... Wow, that's a tongue twister there for you.
Take two.
Let's try this again. That it is in his political interest to do whatever he can to bring the hostages home, or as many hostages as he possibly can home. And I think that the way he can swing that by his coalition partners, both existing coalition partners and perhaps future coalition partners like Ben-Gvir that may return to the coalition after protesting the hostage deal and leaving, is by coming, as you said perfectly yourself, with some sort of agreement on paper from the president, some sort of statement that says Hamas is no longer going to be the rulers in Gaza. It is going to be ruled by some sort of international body, and that might be enough to get it through. And how do I know that might be enough to get it through? Because that's pretty much what Israel did in Lebanon. Israel basically came to some sort of agreement in Lebanon. Much of this agreement was not even agreed upon directly with the Lebanese. It was agreed upon in appendixes to the agreement with the Americans, basically saying that Hezbollah is no longer going to be responsible for South Lebanon, and the Lebanese army is going to replace them. Whether or not that situation ultimately happened in practice, we're seeing partial results. We're seeing the Lebanese army come back to some areas, other areas Hezbollah is still active. But just having that on paper was enough for Bibi to, quote unquote, declare victory and basically sell that to his coalition partners. So I think you're right. I think he's looking for that clause that he can get from Trump, that he can sell victory on paper, I call it, to his coalition partners, and at the same time respond to the domestic outrage over the ongoing hostage crisis and try to bring back as many hostages as he can.
Yeah, I think he really just runs the risk of, look, at the end of the day, I think, you mentioned in a previous episode, Hamas is very much viewed as the modern day Nazis, and that we're sharing a border with the Islamified Third Reich, and that's an unacceptable situation for anybody. So it is an inevitability, I think, that this war will continue, whether that happens in the immediate future or that happens several years from now. It is an inevitability for sure. You have two sides who have basically promised the total destruction of the other. In an existential battle like that, you really have no other choice but to return to fighting. Which is a shame, because again, I remember when I first moved to Israel, I was working at a bar, and my manager, who, funnily enough, I actually ran into in Lebanon. He was in Golani, and he had fought in the 2014 war. And I asked him, what did you think about that? This is before I was in the IDF. This is before any of that. So I was just a curious kid. How was it? And he said he was outraged that the government stopped the war, because he said all that meant is that it was just going to get picked up at a later date. He's like, we're already there. I already lost friends. We already were dealing with this. Why not just finish the job? Unfortunately, I think we've learned from this war, or to be honest, I don't think many Israelis have learned from this war, but it should be obvious that this is not a military solution. This is a political solution. And until Israel is willing to recognize some kind of Palestinian governance in Gaza, whatever that might be, doesn't have to be the Palestinian Authority, doesn't have to be Hamas, but it's got to be somebody, and they should probably be Palestinian, otherwise the Palestinians are going to get pretty pissed. Then this war is just going to continue. And this whole idea of we're going to smash them through military might is a fantasy. I think people are still living in the World War II era, where you can just kind of go in and wipe out an empire via kinetic military action, ignoring the fact that during World War II, we behaved pretty savagely towards, every side behaves savagely. If you want to look at what happened in Berlin once the Soviets arrived, it's really one of the most horrifying things ever in the history of warfare. And that's an option. It's certainly an option that we can turn into Genghis Khan and go in and genocide all the Gazans and declare victory. But what is that going to do to us?
So let me ask you a question then, because I don't necessarily disagree with your point that we need some sort of long term political solution in Gaza. And in fact, we've discussed this in previous episodes, and I've largely agreed with that point in some version or another. But there is this deeper issue of whether or not the Israeli public is ready, whether or not the Israeli public thinks that it has reached the point where it has sufficiently exacted revenge from the October 7th attacks. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm trying to say here. I'm not trying to justify getting revenge and saying this is how a country should plan wars. I understand that most logical countries should plan wars based on objectives they want to achieve on the international stage and knowing the limits of war in achieving those objectives. That being said, I do look at the political discourse in Israel, how that affects what the decision making is going to be of the political establishment, of the new chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, that was just named by the prime minister and the defense minister. And the way I see things now, while I do think that Bibi may take that win from Trump and may use that as a way to temporarily halt the war and bring as many hostages as he can back, in the long term, I don't think we're fully at in Gaza the way that we got to the point that we got to in Lebanon, where we are ready to kind of call it a quits. The way I look at it, and I would love to hear your opinion, I think we're still out for blood, and I think that one way or another, whether it's in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, I think that a return to some degree of fighting is somewhat inevitable in the Gaza Strip.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, don't get me wrong. October 7th and Hamas has completely polluted the Israeli soul to the point where, exactly as you said, it's not even really about military strategy or tactics or any of that. It's cold revenge. It's just a feeling of, you guys made us so afraid and so humiliated on October 7th. And so every time you're pulling a family member out of the rubble, I want you to think of this, because this is what you did to us. And it makes me feel good to see this. That's 100% what's going on. And it's in regards to Lebanon, real quick. Just look, it's easy to call it quits when you feel like a winner, and when you said, "Hey, we smashed Hezbollah, so yeah, we're good, right, Lebanon? We can call a truce and restructure your country in our in the way that suits us best, and kind of just like, call it a day for the most part." But yeah, Gaza, we both have this emotional need for cathartic revenge, and we're feeling like losers. And it's not easy to call it a game when you're on the losing side. If you feel like, it's kind of like being at the poker table or the blackjack table. It's hard to walk away when you're losing because you feel like, oh, maybe the next hand, it's just one more hand and then I can get all my money back, kind of thing.
Right.
It's no, at some point you got to realize your situation and act accordingly.
Yeah, and at least the way I look at it, just to clarify, I don't think that Israel started this war purely out of revenge. I definitely think that Israel had and still has legitimate war aims that it wants to achieve. But certainly, I think part of Israel's reaction was quite similar to America's reaction after 9/11, where Israel was and is out for blood. It's looking to get revenge as its fourth unstated war aim. And I don't think that Israel, like you said yourself, is ready to call it a quits. I think it still needs to exact a further price from Hamas and Gaza.
I think that's a terrible place to be in. I really do. I think that it feels, it's like when you hear stories of veterans from, can be anywhere really, but like Vietnam is probably the biggest example that jumps in my head, where you had these kids go in and they were shooting Vietnamese. Many times they were surrendering, many times they're civilians. And I'm sure in the moment it made them feel good and powerful, especially, you read some of these stories about, you're going through North Vietnam, you're going through minefields, you get hit by snipers, just the frustration of, where's the enemy? Give me somebody to fight. Like, fight, you cowards, fight me. And then you finally finally, after months of this, finally come across somebody. All you want to do is just take all that emotion and pain out of them. I can put myself in their shoes, and I can understand from both an emotional and a comic perspective where they're coming from. And then you hear stories, they come home and they kill themselves. And I think that's kind of, in a way, in a metaphorical way, the direction that Israel's heading. But right now it feels good to kill tens of thousands of Gazans. And yeah, if it's women and children, so what? They're all, the amount of times I've heard Israelis say, it's all Hamas. They're all Hamas. It's like looking at Israelis and being like, they're all Kahanis. They're all Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. It's just so naive. And it's so lacking of all nuance and intellectualism and any real curiosity as to how this conflict could possibly end. And just saying they're all Hamas, it's just dismissive of any responsibility that you might have to your state to say, this isn't right. What's happening right here, it's not effective, it makes no sense, and it's morally beyond the pale. And the Jewish people, and I said this in another episode, the Jewish people have always considered themselves a light unto the nations, a light unto the peoples of the world, as a moral and just people. And this is where the current generation of Jews is taking that responsibility to be the God's chosen people, to be the moral and righteous people who have a pact with God to save humanity. This is the direction we're going with this. It's and look, I don't want to turn this into me just bashing on the Israelis. There's plenty to say about the Palestinians, plenty. But I do feel a responsibility to speak as an Israeli. And I feel like now that I've had, one of the things that this hostage deal has done for me is it's finally given me a moment to breathe, to not be in the war all the time, to not turn on the news and see dead Israeli soldiers and to be furious about it. To see, okay, what was all this for? And I gotta tell you, man, the amount of just despair that I've heard from other Israeli soldiers who fought, especially ones who lost close friends. I got lucky. I lost people I knew, but nobody else particularly, especially close to. I got very lucky. But not everybody's that lucky. And you hear them. And I've talked to them face to face, and you see them with tears in their eyes, just being like, what was it all for? It scares me. It scares me to think what these guys might do. Because they fought for a government and a people that was more interested in pure revenge, in death and destruction, than they were about making real fundamental change. And real fundamental change comes from stepping outside of this desire, this circular desire for revenge, and saying, if we really are the chosen people, if Israel is a light unto nations, then we need to be better than this. We can't just sink into the depths of the human soul and bring out the worst of humanity. We need to be a better people, because that is what's going to make us deserving of having a place like Israel. And in my opinion, I don't know. We're so far from there that it's shameful. It truly is shameful. And by the way, just like the Palestinians are so far from having their own state, just like when you see how they've completely lost the plot, how Hamas is now the face of Palestinian quote-unquote resistance. You think these people deserve a state? They deserve a state where they kidnap babies and women and children and old people and held them underground in tunnels for months? Of course not. Of course not. And then you see our side. And as somebody who grew up in the West and grew up in kind of more liberal environment, I am both blessed and cursed to have a lot of people in my online network who are not so fond of Israel and who are posting things that most Israelis don't see. And I myself, I have to say, I was pretty shocked and horrified at what I'm seeing for the Palestinians who are being released. Emaciated Palestinian children released with their hands cuffed behind their necks, dragged on the buses, and released in this humiliating and inhumane sort of way. I mean, and you can see their ribs. They're like Holocaust survivors. They got scabies on their skin. some of these kids were picked up when they were like 12, 13 years old. It doesn't say why. My guess is probably stone throwing, but who knows? Maybe there was a kid or two who had a rifle, but maybe not. Held in prison for 7 years. What kind of country takes someone who's not their own citizen as a child, holds them in prison for 7 years, and releases them, and they look like fucking skeletons? How do we look at Hamas and say, you guys are so evil and barbaric and yada da da da, and we're doing things that honestly, maybe it's not an apples to apples comparison, but it's pretty fucking horrifying.
I will say one thing I think that makes us different. The one thing that I think significantly differentiates us from them, if there is such a thing as us and them, and that's not an oversimplification of the conflict, is that, at least to the best of my knowledge, I think we're the only parties to this conflict that are asking about themselves the sort of questions that you were asking. I'm not going to pretend that I have many Gazan friends that I speak with on a regular basis. I do not. I don't actively and frequently speak with residents of Khan Yunis and Gaza City about their opinions on the conflict. So I don't know this from personal experience, but at least from what I can read online, on social, and what I see Gazans posting on Telegram, on Facebook, and on other platforms, the only real criticism that I hear of Hamas is criticism of, how dare you for being so selfish and stupid for doing what you did on October 7th and not thinking about us. I very, 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 very rarely, or I can't even think of a single example where I hear criticism within Gazan society about the moral cost of the war to the Palestinian cause and of course what they did on October 7th to Jewish men, women, and children. On the Israeli side, I think it's definitely mixed. I definitely think that you see, for sure, mainstream media does not show images coming out of Gaza and does not reflect Palestinian suffering as a part of the Israeli narrative. But you definitely hear in a much more frequent way the sort of liberal voices that you yourself, I think, embody in a lot of ways. That I think a lot of Israelis agree with you, where they talk not just about the Israeli side, but they also try to be a little bit more holistic and think about Palestinian suffering that comes with that. I think that's one thing that makes us very different, that, you see a lot more, not everyone, but a lot more Israelis that are willing to leave room for Palestinian suffering than you are Palestinians who are willing to leave room for Israeli suffering. And I think you could see that most clearly in the nature by which government criticism exists in both regions.
Yeah, I mean, look, I obviously I'd love to believe that what you're saying is true. I'll just talk in my personal experience. As someone who lives in Tel Aviv, as we both do, it probably is the most liberal city in Israel. Yes, there is certainly plenty of criticism towards the government for usually being responsible for October 7th. The criticism for the war in general, I find in Israel, is few and far between. I don't hear, like Gideon Levy, who is a Haaretz writer, certainly writes about some of the more horrifying actions taking place in Gaza, many of the soldiers who have stepped out of line. There are a few other reporters as well, but they tend to be pretty niche. It's not really something that's discussed at all in mainstream Israeli society. And yeah, I've actually seen a couple of examples as well of Gazans speaking out about the moral implications of October 7th, but it's definitely few and far between, which makes sense considering that, as you said, we don't associate with too many Gazans, nor is it a place that I would imagine is particularly comfortable to speak your mind against the prevailing powers. That being said, I think it's important to take into account that this is a war. And when people are at war, they for those who have never really experienced being in a society at war or directly involved in a war, It's a different kind of mentality that you develop. The friend-enemy distinction becomes much stronger. There's a lack of acceptance for nuance. There's a much greater us versus them style of mentality, and as a result, you're kind of forced to pick a side, and nobody really wants. If you're criticizing your own side, it just makes you suspicious, and it makes you an outcast, an outsider within your own society. So you're pressure within that society to just kind of go with the flow. We as humanity have decided that that is not acceptable, regardless of how prevailing the pressure might be to do so. So it's on the one hand, I get it, and you're like I said, I don't fully agree that there's so much introspection on the Israeli side. It exists, and I'm sure it exists on the Palestinian side as well. In fact, I'm very confident that it does. But it's far outside the mainstream on both ends, and it's far outside the prevailing powers. There's actually a great, the Israel Democracy Institute has some fantastic polling of both Israeli society and actually Palestinian society, ironically enough. And they put out a poll back in November where they asked, do you think the other side wants your complete and total destruction? And 95% of respondents on both sides answered yes. So how do you have any nuance there where 95% of your society is convinced the other side wants their total and complete destruction? And to take it a step further, if you're fighting an existential war, or if you believe it's an existential war, and losing means that not only will you die, your family's gone, your friends are gone, your entire culture, your entire your ethnic group is just gone forever, then what action is not acceptable?
Yeah.
What action is too far? Is October 7th too far? Is carpet bombing neighborhoods and Khan Yunis too far? Like, what's too... If losing is that, then you now have justification to do whatever it takes to be on the winning side. Because losing is just too great of a cost.
Yeah.
And I think that's how both sides look at it.
Yeah, well, I think also both sides are kind of mirroring their own opinions and how they view the other. You think they're all out to kill you because you know how you think about them. So you know, if that's how I think about them, I'm sure that's how they must think about me. And that cycle just doesn't really break. I want to, with your permission, move on to another related topic that you reminded me of when you spoke about the domestic feeling in Israel, in the framework of this hostage release that we're currently going through. One of the things that this hostage release kind of sharpened for me in an interesting way about Israeli society is, among other things, the state of gender relations in the country.
Interesting.
Where we saw in particular over the past few weeks since January 19th, when the first hostages were released, that many of the initial hostages that were released were women, because the deal is organized such that women and female soldiers are given priority in the deal, to be released first. And I looked at this, and I have to say that my feelings were very, very ambivalent. Very, very ambivalent. Where, on the one hand, I saw the female civilians getting released, Emily and others in the first round of the hostage release. I saw later the soldiers, the lookout soldiers get released, Lyria and all of her colleagues that she served with on the Gaza border. And on the one hand, I think alongside much of the Israeli public, was so relieved and so happy for the families of the lookout soldiers and of the female civilians that were finally able to see their loved ones again after not knowing what happened to them. But then there was this other part of me that I was watching this from the side, and I was watching the news talk about the 5 lookout soldiers who got released. And the news, when they were referring to them, the common word that they were using to refer to them was habanot jano, our girls who are coming home from Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And I was listening to this description and this somewhat minimization I felt of these women serving in Gaza, and I felt two things. First, is it a fair description to minimize the role of these 5 lookout soldiers in within the framework of this conflict, and to cast them as just a group of girls that were released in the framework of this deal? I felt that was kind of a minimization of how we view Israeli women's strength and the position of Israeli women in the army, and kind of a degradation, that's a hard word to say, of their status in the IDF. That's one. And two, the fact that Israeli women soldiers were prioritized in this deal above male civilians. I have to say, as much as, I feel I didn't even realize that I had to have an opinion on such matters to prioritize which groups of people are more important to be released than others. So on the one hand, I push back on the very fact that someone dared to ask me such a question. But, I do believe, as someone who believes that all the sexes are equal and men and women are completely equal, the fact that the Israeli political establishment made a decision that female soldiers ought to have their safety prioritized over male civilians, right? That is the official statement of the Israeli political establishment here. I'm not saying I disagree, but I'm saying that it does kind of, in a certain implicit way, diminish the value that we assign Israeli lookout soldiers, and in a certain way kind of say, we really view you as just a group of girls. We don't really view you as soldiers in the IDF. And I was kind of bothered both by the language that was used to describe these soldiers, who, in my opinion, are heroes in the full sense of the word and should be treated as heroes. And, an implicit lowering of women's status in the country.
And you know what the irony of that is that one of the reasons October 7th happened in the first place was because the higher echelon in the IDF command refused to listen to the lookout girls who were saying, Hamas is doing some large-scale training and preparation for something. We should really look into this. You girls don't know what you're talking about. That's the irony. You're 100% correct. It's like, have we not learned our lesson to disrespect our female soldiers who do their jobs quite well, and who, at the end of the day, are soldiers? Look, a lookout soldier can be just as deadly as any man with a rifle. At the end of the day, she can spot where soldiers are. She's the one who's going to be able to direct things like drone attacks, mortars, things like that, to take that guy out, possibly his entire team. These are fully functional, capable human beings who have a mission, and that mission is to kill hostile elements of the opposing side. So, yeah, to treat them like, our girl. Look, it's Israeli society. People get drafted in the army is, in some ways, because the conscript army, and because they draft people right out of high school, the army kind of has this like 13th, 14th, 15th grade kind of feeling to it, because it is something you have to do. It's almost part of your education in some ways. And so as a result, people, and while these Israelis are in the army, they're going home on the weekends a lot of times, staying with mom and dad. Mom's doing their laundry and cooking them food. They're not really adults yet in the fullest sense of the word. They're far from independent. And so in Israeli society, they kind of feel that soldiers in many ways are children. But I think that the question we'd ask ourselves is, well, if they were men, would we be referring them as our boys, our poor boys? We'd be referring to, like, look at these men coming out of Gaza. They're
look at these lochamim. Look at these
warriors. These fighters. They fought. They survived this. Yeah, absolutely. There's it's no question. And
and I wanna, when you said men with rifles are not necessarily more deadly than these female lookout soldiers on the Gaza border, you reminded me of this other tactical failure that Israel made on October 7th, where it basically decided leading up to October 7th to train all women lookout soldiers how to use a rifle to the same degree that many combat soldiers are trained to use a rifle, at least non-infantry combat soldiers like in tank units and in artillery units, but not to give them rifles. And until October 7th, the situation was that women in these lookout soldier roles would be sent to the Gaza border, would be sent to Israel's northern border, would be sent to all of Israel's borders to be in very dangerous areas, and were not given the proper self-protection, because I think there was this kind of, sexist underpinning to all of this of, yeah, like, we don't really trust you with a rifle anyway, you don't really know what you're doing, you're just some girl, and we're not gonna give you this responsibility to do that. Not to say that Israel doesn't have female combat soldiers, it does, and it allows many women to serve in combat, but I think, it definitely is much more regressive and not as advanced as many of its Western counterparts that have allowed women to take on these more combatant sort of roles. October 7th happens, and many of these female lookout soldiers were very much caught without any ability to protect themselves and protect their colleagues on the border of Gaza with the Hamas onslaught. I believe now that's changing, to the best of my understanding. Either there's discussion or there's already been some changes such that these lookout soldiers are now going to be armed as they are already trained to be, and are going to be able to take rifles with them on base. So I believe that either there's discussion about that, or that already has changed to a certain degree.
From what I understand, I think pretty much all military personnel on bases within a certain radius of any hostile border is now armed.
Yeah.
At all times, I mean.
Yeah, which I think is, it's definitely a step in the right direction tactically, but I think we all have to ask ourselves a deeper moral question here of, how did our backwardness when it came to gender relations in Israel kind of lead us to make these really horrifying mistakes. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not by any means trying to minimize the enthusiasm over the Lookout Soldiers release. I'm so thrilled that they're released.
Yeah, no one's blaming them at all.
Yeah.
It's a much greater issue in Israeli society.
Right. I just, I honestly, one of the things that made me think of this is that, there were several reports of these female hostages, both civilians and soldiers, who were asked to leave because they had to be released within the framework of the deal, and they refused to leave. There was, one civilian, Emily, who told her captors that she refuses to leave until the man that was held captive with her at the time, who was sick, who I believe was also recently released in one of the recent rounds of hostage releases, until he was released before her. Liri Elbag, one of the lookout soldiers, our hero, also same situation. When she was told that she had to leave, she told her captors that the other captives that are with her, the other hostages that are with her, should be released before her. So, I think what we're seeing in practice is these hostages, our hostages, behaved like heroes in the fullest sense, and we somehow, still group them in these categories of, our poor girls that we need to save because they're women and they're delicate, and we need to keep them safe from those mean guys in Hamas. And, the big, strong men, will leave them for the end of the deal because we also want to bring them back and we care about them too. But worst case scenario, the deal ends early and the men can deal with captivity better than the women can. I think that, that statement that I'm saying has never been explicitly said by the Israeli political establishment, but I think that's the implicit underpinning of the way the deal has been structured. And I think we have to ask ourselves some moral questions about that of, how do we think that this was right? Maybe we should have structured it such that all civilians should be released equally before all soldiers should be released, if there has to be some sort of order to things, because we're going to put civilian lives before the lives of soldiers. Maybe some other order could have been done, but group all the women together and say, we're going to bring back our girls first, and then we're going to take care of the lochamim who can deal with captivity. I don't know. It doesn't sit well.
Look, I'll tell you what. First of all, two things. One, there's definitely an unconscious gender bias in Israel. Israel is a very conservative country, far more conservative than the United States, and there is an expectation, I think, that men and women fulfill certain roles in that society. And the IDF very much, look, you're not going to find many feminists amongst generals, is an expression I once heard. And I completely agree with it. Despite the IDF letting many women serve in combat, they generally relegate their roles to usually non-hostile borders and areas where they're not going to see combat, so as to not have to deal with the negative publicity of young, cute female soldiers' face plastered on the television screen as killed in action. Because I don't know. I think because again, Israel is not, as a society that believes in egalitarianism, complete egalitarianism between men and women, comfortable seeing something like that. And it's something that I think has a deeper rooting in human psychology, to be honest. I mean, in most cultures, you tend to see a kind of women and children first mentality. You know, in the West, it was very much like that for a long time. In more conservative cultures, it does. I'm not an expert in that, so I don't even want to go down that road. But part two, what I was going to say, though, is that, look, in war, the enemy always gets a vote, and Hamas put the price tag on everybody, and for Hamas, the price for all the women was much lower, which, from Hamas's perspective, kind of makes sense, because Hamas doesn't distinguish between civilians and soldiers. As far as Hamas is concerned, Israel is a conscript army, and so every Israeli citizen, or not even Israeli citizen, because look at all the Thai hostages they took, every individual in Israel is a soldier against the Palestinians. So for them, it's all equal. And women are less of a military threat, and in the eyes of a more misogynistic society. Like, again, I know I didn't want to say that so much, but I'm assuming Hamas, if we kind of look down on our female soldiers, that they probably feel the same about their female soldiers. If they have any female soldiers, to be honest. So for them, they just see them as less valuable and yes, less useful to an army, and so as a result, the price for them is just less.
Just less.
Yeah. Less of their own hostages or less their own prisoners.
There was another big tragedy that came out of this hostage release, where among the 18 that have been released so far, one of the 18 that was released just yesterday was Yeldin Bibas, the father of the Bibas family, whose wife and two children, Shiri and their two beautiful Gingy children, are still in the Gaza Strip. I think that Shiri and her two beautiful Gingy kids were really the symbol of Hamas's brutality on October 7th. And as of now, the IDF has came out with these very vague statements saying that there's a huge concern for the lives of Shiri and her kids. Yeldin just came back to Israel, the father of the family, after not only being taunted and psychologically tortured in captivity, that his wife and two children are dead, as his Hamas captives reportedly told him multiple times. But also himself still dealing with the question of, is it true or is it not true, and still that lack of clarity. I have to say that seeing all the tragedy of the whole Bibas family and everything that plays out with this, I am both deeply personally moved and saddened by way things are developing, and the longer this is going on, the more our hope is kind of being rechecked by the Israeli government, who is coming out with these further vague statements, kind of, I think, preparing us for a tragedy that it can't officially declare yet, regarding the fate of Shiri and the kids. But I think that what's going to happen with that story is going to be a significant watershed moment for Israel, because it's going to be, I think, in the midst of all this mass enthusiasm and everything that's going on, if God forbid something did happen to Shiri and the kids, I think it will be similar to the murder of 6 hostages last year that led to mass protests. I think that any bad news on that side of things is going to be very, very moving in terms of the stability of the deal and the way Israelis perceive the need to continue a war against Hamas in Gaza.
Do you mean to say that they would want to see a continuation of the war, or that they would want the war to end?
Well, I think as of now, because we're getting so many of our hostages back, and many of them are in a much better state than we expected in terms of their physical health. We're so elated by this situation that I think we're just one step away from any heartbreak just completely destroying our euphoria that has taken over the country en masse. And I think that if we somehow had some sort of way to release all of the 79 hostages with the same degree of, the best possible way you could possibly release them that we saw in previous releases, I still think the Israeli public is out for blood, and I still think that we're likely to go back to war. But there would be some chance, if this release did go through in a smooth way, there would be some chance that maybe the war could kind of come to some sort of conclusion. But I think that hot button sensitive issues like the uncertain fate of Shirley and her kids, I think have the chance of, really making a full on war or reopening of the war between the sides a much more likely possibility, and it will strengthen the calls on the Israeli side for an endless war with Hamas in Gaza.
Yeah, I think. I think we're already kind of posed for an endless war. I think it's just, how hot the war is going to be. But no, to your greater point, we've kind of enjoyed. We've enjoyed seeing hostages coming home and for the most part being reunited with their families. Yarden Bibas was the first reminder that not everybody comes home to a happy ending, and I think as we start seeing more and more bodies coming home, that reminder is going to be sunk in deeper and deeper, and what might have started as kind of elation and happiness. The other shoe's going to drop. There are a lot of people who are coming home in body bags, and I think, it's a shame. It's a shame because we had a deal on the table that was substantively not so different from this one, and this was back in the summer, June, July, I think. We rejected it, and now 8 months later, the deal finally went through, or 7 months later, the deal finally went through, and a lot more people are dead, and nothing has fundamentally changed. And that with everything, it's all just a tragedy. It's all of it. I hope, now that Yarden Bibas is home, I hope him and the other hostages can just begin to heal. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have a lot of hope for the situation in a lot of ways. But again, who knows? It's like I always said. If you go back to bring up World War II again, if you go back to London 1939 and you told a Londoner living there, that they were going to win the war, they probably would have laughed in your face. As, Luftwaffe bombs are dropping on them, and the Japanese are bombing Australia, and Germany's 14 miles outside of Moscow, and fast forward, August 1945, the Allies are carving up Germany. But who knows? Who knows what can happen?
Yeah. All right, well, on that somewhat somber, somewhat optimistic note...
take that as you want.
Take it as you want.
I also don't know if that's somber, optimistic.
Which way we want to go with that one. But I guess we'll conclude today's episode. Hopefully, by the next time we record our next episode, we'll see many more hostages released from the Gaza Strip.
We'll have the Trump-Bibi deal to talk about.
That's right.
Never talk about Saudi Arabia this episode.
That's right. Well, we'll keep that as
So there's a lot to. There's also big movements going on in Israel with the judicial reform and the new Supreme Court justice, new IDF chief. There's a lot of new people stepping on the limelight. So lots to talk about.
Lots to talk about, and hopefully, if this deal continues to go through, God willing, hopefully a lot of good stuff to keep talking about. And yeah, all right. That's all for now.
All right, everybody. Take care.